Alrighty, everyone. I hope that everything is good. Let me just do a couple of quick checks. Alrighty, checking YouTube, checking my equipment. Let's see here. Alright, give me a thumbs up in the chat once you are good to go. Once everything is working, if you think everything's good to go and you are ready to roll out here, um, we're gonna be starting in just a moment. Just want to make sure that the audio is working and then the video is working. So, like always, the stream hopefully won't last terribly long, but we're gonna try to go over just the general, overview of the topic today, which is the Cold War, as the title would lead you to believe. If you have any questions at all as the live stream goes on, feel free to throw it up in the chat. If you don't have any questions, you don't have to. At the end of the chat, I'm going to ask that you guys just give me like some type of easy emoji, nothing crazy, um, just so I know that you're good, no questions. There's like 25 or 30 people on the live stream, and I'm waiting for questions. I know that there's about a 30-second lag time between when I'm saying this right now and you hear what I'm saying right now. So um, do me a favor, and if you do have questions, throw them up. If not, no big deal. And if you are going to type a question toward the end, when we have a little bit more time and it's flexible, either tell me, "Hey, I'm typing a question real fast," throw that in chat, or throw up an emoji so that I know you're not typing a question, something like that. So as a general easy thing, and we will get rolling. So we have a few people in. I'll take probably like another minute or so, and kind of wait for people to trickle in if they're going to. But today we are going to be discussing the Cold War as opposed to a hot war, which that is an actual term. So we're gonna go over what those are. So audio is good. Looks like we have multiple people saying audio is good. So let's rock and or roll, shall we? All right. All right. So first and foremost, in order for us to really kind of dive into this, um, we have to kind of describe what a Cold War is versus a traditional war, or what would normally be referred to as a hot war. So, what is a Cold War in general? Not just the Cold War, but the concept of a Cold War. And have there been other Cold Wars in the past? Are we in a Cold War right now? And various, tangents about that. So, a Cold War effectively is going to be when two groups that are relatively equal in power or close enough to where it's not really convincing on either side that anyone could win. So, for instance, the example with the Cold War is the United States and the Soviet Union coming out of World War II. The United States had the upper hand for a little bit because of technology, but soon after the war, the Soviets are going to achieve the atomic bomb, where they're gonna have their own version of the atomic bomb, which kind of evens the playing field. So both nations have very destructive capabilities. Um, for the most part, armies are relatively at a similar technological spot. So neither side has just slam dunk we win territory. It's not like they can just go to war and win outright necessarily. It could have played out that way on either side, but basically you have two groups that are unsure about how the war would go down if an actual war were to be fought. And then whose allies would come in to support who, and how all of that would go, and also how to win a war with someone that's relatively equal. There's a concept that was coined, quite a while ago, called Thucydides' trap, and basically the concept. I'm going to paraphrase the author of the concept here. But basically, the idea is that when one nation rises in power, whatever nation was in power or dominant at the time of their rising, usually what ensues is all-out war as the rising nation tries to usurp or take over the authority of the previous nation. And that's going to be what is more common. As one rises to power, eventually you have something where um, something's going to happen where they're going to want to kind of see, are we better than you, or are you, or whatever the case may be. War will break out. Well, a Cold War is what happens as the country is rising. A Cold War is when both countries are already kind of equal, and neither one of them knows which one they are in this scenario. They don't know if they're the rising power. They don't know if they're the already consistent dominant power, because it's so close across the board that they don't really truly know which one's which, because they've been tied or close to tied for so long. So a Cold War is going to be something that happens in this general time frame. And I put some slides up and I put some reading up, and we're going to go over some of that. Not the I'm not going to show the slides and whatnot on the screen, but we're going to go over some of that stuff. So let's talk about this particular concept. So the Cold War is going to be a different kind of fighting, because we're not going to see. First of all, it's going to last for the better part of 40 or so years, and it's not going to be something that's going to go away. And 40 or so years of a Cold War is definitely going to be a challenge. And it's going to have other concepts that we're going to start to see. We're going to start to see groups of, specifically the United States and the USSR or the Soviet Union. We're going to see these two groups exert influence over parts of the world to get their military, political, and economic objectives accomplished. So we're going to see this in a couple of different ways. The main goal of the United States coming out of World War II is to rebuild Europe and make sure that Europe does not fall to communism. Communism, obviously, if we remember back, is the main economic and political system of the Soviet Union. And the United States was pretty worried about the spread of communism to other parts of the world. So as we exited World War II, there was several different things that kind of went down to avoid a spread of communism. Well, that was the concept, was to avoid a spread of communism. One of those is a concept called the Marshall Plan. So if you're not familiar, basically think about it this way. We have a lot of Europe is going to be even more messed up than World War I left it, because they never really got a chance to recover any of the economic issues that they had exiting World War I before they jumped into World War II. It just wasn't something that they were able to deal with in time. So you have countries like France that had massive trench lines within their country still. A lot of people were subjugated in France specifically, but other areas as well. And for the most part, all of the people in Europe were still left devastated out of World War II. They were still dealing with the fact that they had been fighting in their home turf for this entire time. And one of the biggest fears of the United States was, well, our competing ideology, our competing thought process, our competing political belief was the essence of the USSR. And we looked at it, the United States looked at it and said, well, we have to make sure that our form of government, capitalism, or not our form of government, but a form of economics, capitalism, and our form of government, and our form of government, um, democracy and or the republic model, um, we need to make sure that that continues. So how are we going to do that? Well, in comes one of our very, very famous army generals. Um, he is going to be the chief of staff of the well, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he is going to be General Marshall, and he is going to offer something um, that is going to be called the Marshall Plan, and basically, it's going to be the United States helping to rebuild all of the economies of Europe with, at the time, $13 billion. Now, $13 billion is a grip of money, but all of the countries are going to get a little bit because they want to make sure that they're rebuilt to the point where the U.S. can kind of know that the area is not going to kind of be taken up and grabbed by the Soviet Union. But here's the interesting thing: the two countries that the Marshall Plan is going to throw the most money at is going to be France and the United Kingdom, or Great Britain. So the question is, why? Now, if you think about this, it makes a lot of sense because two of those of the European countries, with France and Great Britain, they had been allies with the United States in World War One. They had been allies in World War Two. And of all of the countries in Europe that have fought the world wars, they were the two most prosperous going into those world wars. So the United States looked at it kind of as a game this way. If we can get Europe on their feet and kind of doing their thing, there is a chance that Europe will eventually be able to be self-sustained. Right? That's the hope, that you can get Europe back going, the economy's rolling again, and everything will be able to sustain what they used to have, and it'll all be great. And then they looked at it and said, well, what were the two most powerful and more prosperous nations of all of the ones in Europe? France and Great Britain. Well, if we can get those two up and running first, then they'll be able to help everyone around them, and then it's more of a domino effect. And that's really what the Marshall Plan was trying to do. It was trying to rebuild all of Europe by first prioritizing Great Britain and France, and then pushing money into the other areas of Europe, trying to fund a rebuilding campaign. Now, it does work. It does work. We also see the creation of other types of institutions, because while the Marshall Plan is going to be rebuilding areas like Italy, Austria, or these parts of Austria, we're going to see Germany split between East and West. As all of this is going to be getting rebuilt, we're going to see the Soviet Union take territory like Hungary, Romania, what will be eventually called Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia. All of these Slavic nations that they had wanted to absorb for years, they now are going to do so. And there's going to be this invisible border on the Slavic nations that now the Soviet Union controls, and the Western European nations that are kind of being helped up by the U.S. And we're actually going to call this line the Iron Curtain. And what's going to end up happening is information going back and forth between the Soviet side and the Western European side is going to be next to impossible. No one's going to really want to see or hear from the other side, because they're completely different viewpoints and ideologies. In 1949, to make sure that there was no issues and to make sure that the Soviet Union wasn't going to take advantage of these weaker nations, a new treaty is going to be formed. And it's something that is still in agreement and still in place today. And it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. Basically, what it says is it's the United States, Canada, Greenland, and then basically all of Western Europe Turkey, and Greece. That's the countries that are in NATO. And notice that all of those countries, they are all countries that are part of the quote unquote Western European group and not part of the Soviet Union's bloc or their communist bloc of countries. And they're going to form a pact or a treaty organization. Now, we've seen this before. We've seen this with, say, the League of Nations. We're going to eventually see it later on with the creation of the UN. And in 1949, we're going to see the creation of NATO. And what's different about NATO than every other kind of time before it to kind of have any kind of solid treaty going on, this treaty is going to basically say, hey, we're going to keep it very simple. All we're going to really say is, if anyone attacks any country in NATO, all countries in NATO agree that we're going to attack that person or that group. We're all going to help each other out, and if they come after one of us, they're coming after all of us. And that's a very clear message, and it's sent mainly to the Soviet Union because of where certain countries were, like Greece and Turkey, are very, very, very close to the now Soviet Union. And they want to make sure that the Soviet Union doesn't decide, hey, we want to invade and take more territory. Similar to how Hitler was trying to take territory early on before World War II, they want to make sure Stalin doesn't think that way. And this is where we start to see the breakdown of Stalin and Russia was on our side at the end of World War II. And it's like, well, how did we get along with them during World War II? But then as soon as the war ends, everyone just doesn't like each other. Like, what's going on? Well, basically, it was more of a treaty or an alliance of convenience. They needed us, we needed them, and that's pretty much where it ended. But once Germany loses and has to surrender, there is no forced coalescing. There's no reason for the Soviet Union, or at least there's not reason for Stalin, to keep any kind of treaty alive post World War II. And that's really what starts the Cold War is both sides don't have a reason because of their polar opposite viewpoints on how countries should run, who should be in charge, and various other fundamental belief systems. So we start to see something that's very unique in war. We're going to start seeing this concept of proxy wars. And a proxy war is very interesting because it's the opposite of what you would think of when it comes to the Cold War. Because the Cold War is like both sides just kind of like think of it as the analogy of like two cowboys in a bar, and they draw their guns in a movie, right? And neither one of them wants to shoot each other, and they're both just like staring each other down. That's kind of the Cold War. It's a standoff. It's that concept where neither side really knows if they're going to be able to win this. So proxy wars are going to start, where the Soviet Union as well as other nations are going to start, and they're going to influence other countries. And as they influence other countries, they're going to basically kind of like fan the flames for war. And the hope is that you can cause damage without actually fighting the war yourself. So, for instance, if there are two wars that the United States will fight, one is the Korean War, the second one is Vietnam. And the idea was whenever communism started to be popular in any region, the United States, under the now used Truman Doctrine, would go out to put pressure on those areas and, if necessary, fight and defeat communism wherever it started to spread up. Basically, wherever communism currently is post World War II, fine and dandy, you can have it. But any other place, no dice. We're gonna fight it. We're gonna make sure that we can remove communism in any way we can. So we start to see proxy wars because of another theory. I know I'm throwing a lot of theories at you, but the idea for communism, or what the American government was afraid of post 1949, was once one country falls to communism, and they use that language specifically, it's a domino effect. So what it means is China is the first major country to become communist post World War II, after the Eastern Bloc kind of gets absorbed by the Soviet Union. China is the next one. And once China becomes communist, it starts to put a lot of pressure on the United States. And they're like, okay, well, that can't happen anymore. And then the theory was, well, once China goes, then Korea will go. Once Korea goes, Vietnam will go, so on and so forth, until all of Asia basically is going to be communist. So that's why eventually, in the 50s, we're going to fight the Korean War. And that is going to be often referred to as the Forgotten War. We're going to see that for the most part, South Korea is going to be saved in this, because it kind of goes through this back and forth period. And in 1953, we basically have a truce that ends the war for the United States. North Korea and South Korea are going to be divided, and that's where they've been ever since. The war technically never ended. They've been at odds with each other for the better part of 70 years or so, but they are still under a peace negotiation or ceasefire. They are not currently actually part. There's not an actual truce or treaty signed. It's just neither side has surrendered yet. So that's kind of where the Korean War ended. And then right after that, we had the Vietnam War in the 60s, where communist rebels were kind of influencing the natives in Vietnam. And the fear was, well, if we don't squash the rebels now, then they'll be able to spread all throughout Vietnam. And the same basic idea would be applied, that another communist nation would be formed. And that was pretty much the United States' main problem generally, was they wanted to, Truman and then all the other presidents after him, to include JFK and LBJ and then Richard Nixon, they all wanted to prevent the spread of communism and the solidification of democracy overall. So that was their plan. And basically a proxy war, if you were to summarize it generally, it's indirect fighting. You're not fighting, you're having another country do the fighting for you. So you're going to move countries or influence countries to do certain things. And the examples that I've given you already, Vietnam and Korea, neither one of those were wars that we used proxy wars for, but the Soviet Union did. But here's the thing. We also used proxy wars to influence countries, and they fought the Soviet Union in a similar pattern. The Soviet Union fought the rebels in Afghanistan, and a lot of the people in Afghanistan, the Taliban and other groups, had been trained by the CIA, and they had been basically the generally, as this is known, they were funded and supplied and trained by American intelligence. So at least that's the understanding. So that they could fight the Russians in Afghanistan and defeat the Russians in Afghanistan. And that was the main objective, was to put more pressure on the Soviet Union. So we have a couple of concepts here. What happens in a Cold War? Well, you first have some kind of Thucydides trap model where neither side is going to be really sure where they stand. The next thing, you're going to see proxy wars start to form, where neither side wants to fight each other directly. They're going to use other groups to do the fighting so that they don't risk all-out war themselves, because then they can claim deniability and whatnot. It's not us, it's the North Koreans. It's not us, it's the Vietnamese. It's not us, it's insert group here. That's kind of the idea. And then you start to get closer and closer to what Eisenhower is going to call brinksmanship, or threatening the use of nuclear weapons. Basically, whenever anyone says we come to the brink of war, they're referring to nuclear war, because nuclear war is what everyone's afraid of. All the nations of major prominence have very destructive military capabilities, and that's the issue: is that the nuclear warheads that both countries have, or that many countries have, could destroy the entire world several times over. And we call this concept mutually assured destruction. Neither side can kill the other side fast enough to avoid an all-out like planetary bombardment type of situation. Or at least that's the theory. So for most of the between the 50s and I'd say the mid 80s, most of the Cold War was fought by groups trying to find ways of having first strike capability, being able to strike either side without them knowing. We see this with the space race. That's why the space race was so important for a lot of people, was because this was a way for us to, and on both sides, for the Soviets when they launched Sputnik, and then eventually with our Apollo program, it was the way for everyone to notice that this is a way to control first strike capability. That was really the idea: was how can we make sure that we have first strike capability, and that was the concept, was using a space race kind of scenario. All right, last but not least, let's talk about something that happens in the 1960s under President Kennedy's watch, and that is the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, Cuba is about 90 miles off the coast of Florida, so pretty dang close. And we start to get word that nuclear weapons are being moved into Cuba. And before too long, enough of them are on Cuban soil, and the Soviet Union had brought them there. And the idea was that we did the math effectively. Washington, D.C. was in this kind of Goldilocks zone from Cuba. It's about a 1,300 mile kind of diameter, with Cuba being the center there. And if you draw a circle, that's 1,300 miles around there. Washington, D.C. is just within that zone. And the reason why that was important is 1,300 miles is effectively, for the missile systems that they had at the time, if a missile was launched in Cuba, we would not be able to react fast enough if the target was within 1,300 miles. So effectively, what that means is we would not be able to really even know the missiles in the air long enough for us to be able to either get people out of Washington, D.C., or other areas of southeastern United States. So it was a big deal, and it caused a ton of problems. And this entire problem is going to be kind of another example of this proxy war. It wasn't the Soviet Union who was fighting or was being a threat to the United States. It was Cuba. They just happened to be supplied by the Soviet Union. So that's kind of the issue going forward, is that we have two dominant powers, and they're going to kind of be playing chess with all of the other nations that are their allies, or people that are assisting them. And that's going to be the essence of the Cold War, is both groups effectively kind of using other nations to get their jobs accomplished, or to get any kind of semblance of dominance within whatever region they're talking about. All right, that was about 25-30 minutes or so. Are there any questions about the concept of a Cold War, or anything about the Cold War that we've talked about, or anything from the reading or the slides, anything at all? I'll open it up to questions if you guys have it. Feel free to throw it down into the chat. If you do not have questions, I would like you to put out a smiley face emoji, just so I know that you're here and we're good and that there aren't any issues. So give me a smiley face emoji if you have 0 questions. If you do have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat, like I said, and I will do my best to answer those and help you guys out. But this is your time to kind of get any questions answered, and we can go from there. We got 1 smiley face. 2, 3. Oh, Matt, with your upside down smiley face. Alrighty. Well, if there are no other questions, or there are no questions at all, this is pretty much what I had to go over today. The question, let me just kind of read it back for everybody, just so we can kind of go through this and make sure everyone understood it real fast. Let me see what I wrote. So, what was the important impacts? What were the important impacts, I should say? I was tired when I wrote this, apparently. What were the important impacts of the Cold War? How did the Soviet Union and the United States go about fighting, in quotes, the Cold War? So, that last part is going to refer to specifically forms of proxy fighting or proxy wars, that concept. So, describing that general mindset. And then, as far as the important impacts of the Cold War, think about the increasing technology. What does the Cold War actually give us as a benefit? Think of it as a motivating factor that leads other nations to do things that they maybe not have done. Basically, the entire space race happens because of the Cold War. So there are some good things that came about from the Cold War, although generally when the term war is bad. So we just have to kind of be mindful of what's going on. Alrighty, folks. It looks like we're good to go. I appreciate everyone showing up. It is 2:20, which means we've been on here for about 35 minutes or so. Throw me any questions into email or to Canvas. I will have live streams next week on Monday and Wednesday, as per usual, 1:45. If you have any questions at all, please ask and send them my way. Otherwise, have a good one. Peace.